So I just finished up my first debate. Now this was pretty informal, but hey, I'm proud of it. And I put all this time into my opening statement, and I quoted a bunch of sources. But since it was a debate, I couldn't have my sources on the screen while I was talking about them. So I thought it might be fun to kind of just take my opening statement and then edit it into like an actual edited video where I'll put my sources up on the screen, and I'll also have my sources linked down below. So if you already saw my debate, feel free just to refer to this video if you ever want to see the sources that I quoted, and you can also just grab the link down below. But also, not everybody's into like hour-and-a-half long live stream debates, and so if you're not and you just want to see me defend the premise that reasonable, rational people can reject Catholicism on philosophical grounds, then great. Enjoy my little 15-minute opening statement edited with my sources. So thanks for watching, and see you next time. Okay, so today's prompt is: it is reasonable to reject Catholicism on philosophical grounds, for which I am taking the affirmative. I will argue in my opening statement and then in the following open dialogue and Q&A that it is reasonable to reject Catholicism on philosophical grounds. What exactly do I mean by this? What I mean is that I'll argue that the Catholic Church commits her members to certain philosophical positions, and that a reasonable person can reject those philosophical positions. I'd like to start off by explaining what I am not arguing. I am not arguing that all reasonable people will reject Catholicism. I think that there are a ton of very reasonable Catholics, from Catholic talk show hosts like David here on Catholic Versus, to Matt Fradd and Thursday on the Pints with Aquinas team, to Anthony and Rob from Avoiding Babylon, who I know you've had on your show, David, and some of my favorite Catholic apologists, Kyle Whittington, Trent Horn, Jimmy Akin, some Catholic PhD philosophers like Dr. Jim Madden, priests like Father Brown, who I've had on my show, and priests like the priests at my very chapel that I attended growing up. I think that all of these Catholics that I've listed here, and obviously tons more, are very rational people. The church has a rich philosophical history. Obviously, Aquinas is a giant of medieval philosophy, but people like William of Ockham, who I will be leaning on in this debate, were also Catholic. If I wanted to argue that no Catholics are reasonable, I wouldn't be able to use like any of the sources that I'm citing for my opening statement. So that's what I am not arguing, that no Catholics are reasonable. That's certainly not the case. But what am I arguing? Essentially, I'm arguing that I think that more people than there currently are should be agnostic. I do understand the philosophical positions that I'm going to argue against. At least I think that I understand them. And I reject them anyway. I think that I'm a rational person. At least I hope so. And I think that rational people can wind up on either side of these three topics that I'm going to bring up. Okay, so what is the first of those three topics that I'm going to bring up? If anybody knows my work, nobody will be surprised by this first one. That is nominalism. Nominalism is the belief that universals do not exist. This is in contrast to realism. And realism is just the belief that universals do exist. And I think that most Catholics today are realists. Specifically, they are realists like Aquinas, that is to say, moderate realists. But for the sake of time, I'm not going to get into the difference between moderate realism and Platonism. I think it's just safe to say here, realists think that universals exist, nominalists don't. So, what are universals? Well, first, mankind is a universal. Substances are universals. And the Council of Trent relies on substances and how it couches transubstantiation. So I see some tensions between nominalism and Catholicism right there at the Council of Trent. Now, the Jesuits have done some pretty cool work in trying to understand the real presence without transubstantiation, strictly speaking. But I think that there's a worse problem for the Catholic nominalist, and I think that would be natures. Natures are another universal. The Catholic nominalist would be somebody who says, yeah, natures don't exist, but also Jesus has two natures, the human nature and the divine. Like, that just seems like it can't be done. I think, like, I don't know how somebody can be both a Catholic and a nominalist. So if that's the case, then there's tension here, right? So, okay. So we've established that the Catholic probably can't be a nominalist. But I'm not just saying that nominalists can't be Catholics. I'm saying rational people can reject Catholicism based on philosophical grounds. So why would a rational person be a nominalist? Let's discuss that real quick. So I'm going to lean heavily on the article called Nominalism and Metaphysics, first published in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy back in 2008, but it's available for free online. So if you just Google Nominalism and Metaphysics, the SEP, Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, is probably going to come up. Okay. One argument against postulating abstract objects or universals or abstracta, it's all the same thing, is based on Occam's razor. I said I'd bring Occam up again. According to this principle, one should not multiply entities or kinds of entities unnecessarily. Thus, if one can show that certain concrete objects can perform all the theoretical roles usually associated with abstract objects, one should refrain from postulating abstract objects. The effectiveness of this appeal to Occam's razor is, of course, conditional upon us having shown that concrete objects can play all the same roles as the abstract objects, but I'll argue that they can. And in fact, most realists agree that they can. Most realists agree abstract objects are causally inert. Back to the SEP article, another common and widely discussed argument against abstract objects is an epistemological argument. The argument is grounded in the thought that given that abstract objects are causally inert, it is difficult to understand how we can have knowledge or reliable belief about them. Admittedly, these arguments do not establish nominalism, but they do establish some kind of explanatory lacuna. A lacuna is a word that means an unfilled space or gap in realism. The challenge for the realist is to explain how knowledge of and reference to abstract objects is even possible if those abstract objects are causally inert. And it's also worth pointing out that some of the most famous deniers of abstract objects, some of the most famous nominalists, have not even based their nominalism on arguments at all. That is the case, for instance, for Goodman and Quine, who, in their steps towards a constructive nominalism, based their rejection of mathematical objects on basic intuition, and this was back in the 1940s. Other well-known nominalists include people like Francis Bacon, David Hume, and John Stuart Mill. Also, according to the Canadian philosopher of science, Ian Hacking, who actually just passed away, I think, earlier this year, most of science, contemporary science, I should say, is motivated by an unstated, nominalistic metaphysical worldview. Okay, I do know that nominalism requires the nominalist to bite some bullets, and I fully expect to get into that in the dialogue and then the Q&A. But for now, let me move on to point number 2. Point number 2 is Mereological Nihilism. Mereological Nihilism is the denial of composite objects. And I'm going to follow the same format here as I did the first one. First of all, why is this incompatible with the Catholic Church? And then secondly, why would a rational person hold this view? So consider a universe in which the only thing that exists is composite object X, and I'm putting composite object X in air quotes because the mereological nihilist would deny composite objects, and composite object X is composed of simple parts A, B, and C. The mereological non-nihilist would say 4 things exist: A, B, and C, and X, because X is the composite object of A, B, and C. The mereological nihilist would say, no, only 3 things exist, A, B, and C. And sure, A, B, and C exist in some kind of arrangement, and we call that arrangement X, but X isn't a thing with any real existence. That's the difference between the two. I'm going to argue that you cannot be both a mereological nihilist and Catholic. Why? Because of Catechism of the Catholic Church, entry 364, in which the CCC defines what it is to be man. Man is a composite object, specifically a composite of body and soul. I'm going to quote CCC 364. The human body shares in the dignity of the image of God. It is a human body precisely because it is an animated spiritual soul, and it is the whole human person that is intended to become, in the body of Christ, a temple of the Spirit. Man, though made of body and soul, is a unity. It goes on, but I think that last sentence there was the important part. In Catholicism, there appears to be like a true self, and the self is composite. The body alone is composite too. Let's not, forget that. But suffice to say that the body and the soul put together is certainly a composite object. And that's what man is, according to the Catholic Church. The Mereological Nihilist denies the existence of the self, strictly speaking. So it seems to me that somebody cannot be both Catholic and a Mereological Nihilist. Okay. But why would a reasonable person be a Mereological Nihilist? Well, for this, I'm going to lean heavily on an essay titled Against Parthood by Ted Cited. The argument that Cited lays out in this work is an argument from parsimony. It is simpler to be a nihilist about Mereology. Cited spends pretty much the rest of his essay shooting down objections to Mereological Nihilism. Cited argues against the intuition that composite objects exist, saying that intuitions can be and often are wrong. He argues against the perception objection, saying that really what we are perceiving is the Mereological simples arranged xy's. We're not perceiving x directly. He argues against the notion that we are required to believe that composite objects exist because, well, we exist and we're Mereological and we are composite, by simply saying, no, what we are is a collection of simples arranged us-wise. The best thing that I think that the Catholic can do in terms of the Mereology debate is to take the Van Inwagen approach. Van Inwagen was actually Ted Cider's professor too, so it's just kind of like a funny little thing to note there. And Van Inwagen was like this close to being a Mereological nihilist, but he wasn't. Van Inwagen argued that the only real composite objects that exist are the organics. I don't accept this, since it seems like special pleading to me. Also, because the vagueness of the category of life seems like a problem here. When does something get like caught up in life? So consider like a cat that like takes a breath and it inhales like some oxygen, and that oxygen is eventually going to like enter the cat's bloodstream and stuff like that. But at what moment does that part of that oxygen molecule become part of the cat's body? That kind of seems arbitrary to me. So I don't accept that. However, I do like where Van Inwagen is going with this. And I think that that's like a really, if I were to try to marry Mereological nihilism with Catholicism, because I was convinced that both were true, I would be looking really heavily into Van Inwagen's work. Okay, that was the second. The last thing that I'm going to talk about today is teleology. Teleology is the fourth and final of Aristotle's four causes in his Physics. Notice that I said physics, not metaphysics, because Aristotle never used the word physics. He never used the word metaphysics. He just used the word physics. The word teleology comes from telos, meaning end or aim or goal, and then logos, meaning explanation or reason. And Aristotle argued that one of the reasons that an acorn grows into a tree is because an acorn has the telos of to grow into an acorn tree. Catholicism relies on teleology heavily, I will argue, especially for sexual ethics. The reason why gay relationships are wrong is because all non-procreative sexual acts are wrong. So of course, gay acts are going to be necessarily non-procreative. Why are non-procreative acts wrong? Because it frustrates the telos of the act, or at least it frustrates one of the teloi of the act, teloi being plural of telos. But I reject teleology, as does the vast majority. Well, vast is going to be a contentious word here, but I will say most philosophically inclined scientists today do reject teleology. This has been happening for hundreds of years, I will argue, this move away from teleology. I'm going to quote M.R. Johnson's 2008 work, Aristotle on Teleology, published in the Oxford University Press, pages 23 and 24, when he says, the received intellectual tradition has it that in the 16th and 17th century, so almost 500 years at this point, revolutionary philosophers began to curtail and reject the teleology of the medieval and scholastic Aristotelians, abandoning final causation in favor of a purely mechanistic model of the universe. Wikipedia puts the dividing line for teleology at the work Novum Organum by Francis Bacon, saying that since the publication of that work in 1620, teleological explanations in physical science tend to be deliberately avoided in favor of material and efficient causes, to put it still in Aristotelian language. But teleological language does still hold some sway today, particularly in biology. Biologists will use teleological language to describe bodily functions. The heart's purpose is to pump blood. And in evolution, the heart evolved to pump blood. But I will argue that many philosophically inclined biologists will say that this is simply an example of, quote, speaking with the vulgar. Vulgar not meaning like curse words, vulgar meaning the vulgate, the common folk. There's an article called Teleology, the explanation that bedevils biology, again published in the Oxford University Press in 2004, that begins like this. Biology is sick. Fundamentally unscientific modes of thought are increasingly accepted and dominate the way the subject is explained to the next generation. The heart of the problem is that we persist in making, literally then in brackets, making sense of a world in which we now know to be senseless by attributing subjective values to the objects within it, values that have no basis in reality. So we reject teleology thanks to parsimony, again, shaving it off using Occam's razor. There's simply no need to posit it, so we don't. In conclusion, I'm going to try to end on something that I think is both my strongest and my weakest point. I'm defending that it's reasonable to reject the Catholic Church based on philosophical grounds. So I'm going to commit an informal fallacy here by appealing to authority. I think that this should give somebody pause and like really consider my points, but under no circumstances should somebody take this point as like definitive proof that they're like, hey, look, some PhDs agree with me, therefore I must be right. Okay, that being said, more philosophers are nominalists than are realists, at least according to the 2020 Philpaper Survey. 42.85% of philosophers are nominalists, 38.38% are Platonists. And then 8.36% are agnostic on the issue. 5.74% accept some alternate view, and I imagine that those alternate views include the Thomistic style people, the moderate realists. And then there's like another 5% that think that the question was unclear. So if you do want to argue that it's unreasonable to reject Catholicism based on at least nominalism, for instance, then I think kind of what you're arguing is that 42.85% of philosophers are not reasonable people. Again, this is a fallacy. Like this argument that I'm making is an appeal to authority. So this point here that I'm making is not knocked down by any stretch of the imagination. But I do think this should give somebody pause, because if you are positing that 42.85% of philosophers are irrational, I'm going to look at you funny and think like, well, maybe it's not as cut and dry as you think that it is. Okay, I couldn't find great data on the Mereological Nihilism or teleology in terms of like how accepted those views are in philosophy today. I think because they're kind of niche. But that same Philpaper survey that I listed states that 67% of philosophers actually accept or lean towards atheism. And I mean, maybe atheistic Catholics is the next frontier for our friends the Jesuits. But until then, I think that the Catholic would need to argue that 2/3 of all philosophers are irrational to reject Catholicism through their atheism. That's going to be it for me. Thank you for listening. David, I look forward to hearing your response, and then I look forward to doing the back and forth after.